Hello, everyone. This is Kristen Huber, and on behalf of Eaton and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled, DCIM Maturity is Accelerating Successful Growth. Leading off today's interactive discussion will be Andy Lawrence, who is Vice President of Research at 451 Research, as well as Executive Director of Research at Uptime Institute. Joining Andy will be Mike Jackson, who is Senior Product Line Manager of Software Platforms at Eaton. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen below. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session, and we'll respond to all unanswered questions via email after the webcast concludes. This presentation and slides will be made available for download once the webinar concludes. And finally, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy and Mike.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andy Lawrence, as you have just heard. I'm the Executive Director of Research at the Uptime Institute. I'm sure you've already all heard of us. I'm also a VP of Research at 451 Research. A lot of researchers in there. And basically what I do is research the data center market in great depth, pretty well 100% of my working life. And DCIM, Data Center Infrastructure Management, has been a special subject of mine for many years. So it's of great interest today that we're able to drill in a bit at what I think is a bit of an inflection point in the development of the DCIM market, and we're going to talk about whether DCIM is moving from a stage of promise to greater delivery, and whether it now is going to see accelerated growth in the market. So I'm joined today by Mike Jackson, and we're going to have, this is going to be more of a discussion than a presentation, but with slides. So I'm going to ask Mike of Eaton just to quickly introduce himself before we get started.
Sure, thanks, Andy. So as Andy said, Mike Jackson, I am our Senior Product Line Manager for Software Platforms. So within Eaton Corporation, I'm in the U.S. and the Raleigh area. So I oversee all platforms that have anything to do with the data center vertical. So everything from DCIM to our virtualization, power management software platforms as well.
Great.
Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Mike. So start with a kind of little history. So I suppose DCIM has been around for probably since, maybe you could say 2006, maybe a little earlier in some early implementations, and the market has gradually grown since then. I think the period where it really started to kind of get that hype and take off and attention was somewhere around 2008. And it interested a lot of people, investors, venture capitalists, data center operators, entrepreneurs, because it had this great promise. Data centers were getting increasingly complex. There were more and more of them. And it was clearly something that needed real-time, sophisticated management, and had a lot of problems that are perfect for software. So there was this promise of better control, improved agility, cutting costs, reducing failures, improving PUEs and energy efficiency, overall risk reduction. Actually, in the subsequent 8 years or so, I think a lot of the market saw and heard a completely different story, which was the deployment times were lengthy, and lengthy deployment always means money and difficulty. There were a lot of cancelled deployments, a lot of kind of shelfware, and many of the deployments we heard about issues of scalability, of inaccurate databases, problems integrating, and overall, they didn't really have the operational impact. So notwithstanding some really good successes and not trying to say all the products were bad during that period, but there certainly was a lot of problems. So as a supplier, Mike, does this view resonate with you?
I think it does, definitely. As we've kind of watched this market over the years, we definitely have seen some ebbs and flows and some growth challenges, and I think it's been an interesting market to watch. I know you've had the pleasure of watching it through your role as well, but it's been an interesting road from 2008 to today for sure.
Right. So the next slide kind of reiterates what I just said, but I really wanted to say that to show this because these are two slides from presentations that Uptime gave in 2016, and one of them is titled "Why is the ROI on DCIM so terrible?" and the other highlights a procurement disaster at a big financial company. And I think what actually happened then is we saw that this definitely scared a lot of people off of doing extended implementations. And the market, it's reasonable growth for any market, 13%, but for a hot young market, it's hardly dramatic. And if you think even by about now, it's just under $1 billion a year, according to our research at 451. But you think you've got to, that is divided up between 5 and 30 suppliers across the world. So it's not great, and I think that is partly been because of all of the problems. And if you think of that number in context to the overall spending on data centers globally, it's pretty small. And I think a lot of people looked at that and said, well, that we're not going to go into that market. And a lot of people stayed on the sidelines. And Mike, Eaton, one of the true leaders in data center equipment, you guys stayed really out of the mainstream DCIM market until quite recently, didn't you?
We did, yes. So I think if you look at the way we looked at this market is at the same time DCIM started to uptick was really when server virtualization took off. And I think it's our decision at the time, we put our chips on the virtualization side and started to go down that path. And so we skipped the initial phase of DCIM and that first kind of path down that process. And so you ask why are we here now, and I really think it's because our customers, because we touch so many data centers, are asking and they want it. And so it's been a good change of pace. So I think we've gone a long way down from a virtualization capability standpoint and tying it to power. But our customers are asking for DCIM. And so that really was the impetus of us, getting into the DCIM market.
Right.
Because we had many customers saying, "Hey, this is real now, and we want to do it." So, how are you going to help us get there?
Right. Okay. So as we move on through our discussion, we're going to be using quite a lot of data from a survey that Uptime Institute has done. We do an annual survey. It's the biggest in the industry. We had just under 1,500 respondents this year. Just over about 1,000 of them, around 1,000, are classed as data center operators of some kind. And we've been asking them questions about DCIM every year. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen something of an inflection point. We're starting to see a bit of a change in attitudes. So first of all, it's never clear exactly what the adoption levels of DCIM are, but you could see here that we're starting to see more and more companies saying yes, they have DCIM. So about a third, just under a third, 32% are now saying we do have a DCIM product installed, a commercial product, and 22% are saying they combined that with some kind of custom in-house tool, and another 11% say they have some kind of in-house tool. Now, I really should caution, I always doubt surveys, including our own. What one person thinks of as DCIM could be what somebody else thinks of as BMS, and although we try to steer people to give consistent answers. You can never be sure. And also, some people have very large deployments, and some people have little more than a pilot, and obviously data centers can vary in size greatly. But even so, this is quite a high number. I mean, this is sort of starting to look like a mainstream product. So again, I'd just like to ask Mike, any comments on that kind of take up? Does that surprise you? Does it seem high?
I think the big takeaway here is the fact that people don't necessarily want to rely fully on it, or I think adoption. I definitely think adoption is happening. So numbers don't surprise me, but I definitely concur with people are trying to take systems that they already have and tying them together. So that's definitely one big consideration here.
We're going to come back to that a little bit more in a minute. So we also, one of the things we do is we kind of separate off the suppliers who answer them, and we ask them a different set of questions, and that includes data center designers, builders, and consultants, and so on. Just 21% are saying most clients are deploying at scale. So, this is just reiterating the point. This isn't a market share figure, but it does seem now that we're starting to see more adoption, more acceleration. So I've got to confess that we have a little trouble squaring some of these numbers with the revenue figures that we see from the suppliers, because really the market should look a bit bigger. I haven't quite worked out why that is. It could be due to discounting or pricing, or maybe some of the revenues don't always get captured. But I think the takeaway for me is, as Mike just said, we're entering a mainstream market now where DCIM is a mainstream product. So to pick up on what Mike was just saying, we asked them what stage they're at. So you could see here that 47% said that they successfully implemented DCIM, and they are supplementing with more tools. And 28% said they had successfully implemented DCIM, and their requirements were successfully met by the first vendor. Mike, I'm intrigued by this more tools supplement. What is that in your experience? What are people adding? It sounds to me like they're using DCIM as a bit of a platform, but maybe that's not the right way to read it.
Yeah, I think when you really get into what we can do with a DCIM tool, there's other pieces as companies become more mature with the DCIM itself. They realize there's a lot of value to it, but they want to tie it to other systems. So I think you mentioned building management systems. I think that's a big tie that people are using. I think we're also seeing a lot of ties into IT systems, server management platforms, and things of that nature. Again, just to extend the knowledge that DCIM gives you and the capabilities, and really start to drive action coming out of that data. Right.
Okay. So I think also interesting and not entirely surprising to me is 16% saying, yeah, it didn't quite work out first time. They're trying again. They're working on a second implementation, probably with a different supplier, I'd imagine. And while that seems quite high, from my knowledge of the software market, I would say that's not that surprising. It's quite common in a lot of markets to see people trying with one package and coming back again. But there is that 10% number of saying, we've had enough, we're not going to try again, which is quite interesting. Okay, so here's the bottom line. 74%, and this is when you add up the earlier numbers, 74% have come back and said DCIM is the deployment was successful. So this is really, what I think is the inflection point I was talking about. It's not just market adoption; it's the fact that people are actually adopting successfully. So something has changed, and we're going to talk a bit about that. But Mike, this is a better time for you to be in the market, right? Because I've been in various discussions where people are saying, is it the supplier's fault because the product isn't good enough, or is it the operator's fault because they don't know how to deploy properly? But whichever way you look at it, it seems that those problems have been solved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with knowledge comes the ability to do it better. So you're right. We're definitely, we started to enter at the right time to where we've had a lot of time to understand, what caused those failures early on. And I think you hit it on the head. It's a mix of, inflated customer expectations and lack of capabilities when the platforms, and when the two of those come together, it is a recipe for an unhappy outcome.
Right. I guess you got to look at that and say, well, 26%, not so happy, but I think it's a changing picture. It'll probably be lower next year.
I agree.
Also interesting to me, this 62% said they got significant benefits within the first full year. So this notion of very expensive deployments with an extended ROI, again, we seem to be moving beyond that. Does that ring true? Do you get benefits in things like presumably, immediately better reporting, better monitoring? Would you agree that it's fairly immediate, the benefits?
Absolutely. I think there are definitely benefits within DCIM that you will see the moment you turn on the platform itself. There's definitely some midterm that I think within that first year, there's some features that I would say take a little bit of time to grow and become accustomed to, and they really start to ratchet up that ROI. And then there are things over a longer period of time that you'll start to see outside that first year. But yeah, I agree. I think most of the deployments we've seen, customers can see substantial improvements within their business and their processes within the first year.
Right. And I'm just going to say as an aside, we don't have a chart on this because it's data that's reasonably fresh and we're still kind of looking at it. But when we did some analysis of things like outages and PUEs of those who had DCIM and those who did not, we actually found there was a very slight drop in PUE, but we did find a drop in outages. So it does seem, and the one reason I put it in because I want to make sure that we can substantiate this, but it does look as though data centers with DCIM experience fewer outages. And also they say that they're better, they feel more confident to compare risks and performance in different data centers, and more have implemented chargeback. So it does seem now that we're starting to see data that shows that DCIM is really an essential component of a successfully run data center. So my comment on this slide, DCIM vendors mostly meet expectations. 65% said yes. 35% said no. Well, 65% is good. I think if it was a product on Amazon and 35% said no, I'm not sure you'd buy it. But again, I'd expect it to be a changing picture. I don't know if you have any comment on that, Mike, before I move on.
Yeah, again, I think it's it really comes down to the deployment and setting those expectations. So we'll talk more about it, how to avoid that trap. But I really think it's from the onset. If you don't have your mindset right, you're going to end up in that negative portion. Right.
Now, cost is a very interesting issue. So 46% said the DCIM, did the DCIM cost more than you expected? And 54% said no, it didn't cost more. So I guess that means they're happy. It is interesting to me because we have looked at this over the years, and one of the big issues has been and I think one of the reasons why there's been dissatisfaction is data center operators. They often don't have IT departments, so they don't really know necessarily fully understand how IT budgets and organizations are run, and there's a very high operational cost, and there's usually a very high deployment cost in IT, and not data center operators didn't always fully allow for that. So, we often say that you should budget 50% for deployment, consulting, integration. I think now that the data center owners and operators have become more realistic, and they have actually set more aside, and therefore it comes in more realistically against budget. But again, this looked much uglier a few years ago. So again, an area where it's important. What do you think about people's budget and cost expectations, Mike?
Yeah, I totally concur. I think it was a big challenge early on, and I think people are really understanding that if they don't align the organization and set it up front, that they're going to have a challenge. And if they miss a large piece of the deployment, like tying it into IT, that's definitely going to drive an overrun, because to get a lot of the value, if they don't have that integration, they're really going to miss their ROI. So they're going to need it
right.
to make it successful.
Okay, so we also asked, what did your success depend on integration with personnel outside of the department, which presumably is the core facilities department? And 66% said yes. That's very interesting to me, and we should probably drill into that at some point. I'm figuring they really mean the IT department, both in terms of help and in integration, possibly others. But it's clear that DCIM is a project. Mike, what do you think that 66% applies to?
I definitely think a big portion is tying it from it starts at a facilities level and it goes into IT. But I mean, you mentioned things like chargeback earlier, so you're talking to finance people, you're talking to business unit leaders. There are definitely, as you kind of continue to grow in scope, you will start to pull in different functions within businesses that are starting to see an impact from kind of this improved operational experience that the data center is getting.
Who do you find is the main buyer?
It tends to be the facilities level, but the majority of conversations you don't get very far before the IT gets involved, and then you'll end up in the C-suite pretty quickly. But I think the entry in most places is through a facilities team that's managing the data center itself.
Yeah, so they're obviously the people who are going to operate it and who kind of care most about it.
Absolutely.
And then defining requirements, we found this was, a really critical thing. And it plays to everything we've spoken about, not just functional requirements, but staff and budget and everything. We found that quite often people would buy, without having a clear idea of why they were buying. They just felt that they needed to do it. Things have changed a lot, and I think that probably, because there is a lot of hard work, especially in getting data into the DCIM system. There is quite a lot of hard work, and I think unless they had their requirements very accurately worked out, they would struggle. Do you see that changing at all? Do you see a lot of RFPs that are much more specific and people clearly know what they want?
Absolutely. I think it's growing substantially. You're going from RFPs that have 30 line items to now we're seeing them with well over 300. So customers are definitely understanding it significantly better, and it seems that they're much more educated, and they realize that the impact goes far beyond just a feature set. So yeah, it is definitely changing from a requirement standpoint and setting it out.
Right. Okay. And then just flipped onto staffing, as it shows the same picture. And again, one of the things that we've seen over and over again is that DCIM does require quite often process changes and quite a lot of technical expertise to operate well. Ideally, it wouldn't require any, but it often does. So staffing adequately at the outset is obviously important. So I just wanted to emphasize that so two things here is we're seeing that there are still issues. It would be wrong to say that everything's now perfect. There are quite a lot of issues that make DCIM deployment still quite challenging, as you'd expect it to be, because it's not a simple purchase. But also the landscape is changing a bit. Mike's already alluded to virtualization, and obviously we're a decade into that, but because of obviously more cloud, more distributed workloads, starting to see different kinds of problems emerging. So this is from a slightly different section of the survey, but forecasting future data center capacity, in a way, it's a management issue. It's not just about managing the facilities. It's about knowing, what the demand is going to be in the data center as a whole, or just in areas of the data center. And then lack of qualified staff is another example where we're hearing a lot about that in the industry. So I think that there are management changes rather than technical are presenting quite a lot of challenges. What do you think about these challenges, Mike?
I absolutely think that they are spot on. Those would probably be the top four that you come across.
Right. Okay. Good. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mike. He's got a few more slides for some other discussion points. We're probably covering some of the same areas, but just looking at them in a slightly different way. Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. So I just wanted to just quickly reiterate, why DCIM and talk about some of the stumbling blocks, because if you're looking at deploying, it's really key. Obviously, I want anyone going at it to be successful. So let's understand why DCIM. So really, with each feature, there's two main stages. One is getting at the data, and then two is doing something with that data. So if you look at what are the core things within DCIM, what are the core capabilities you need? Capacity is obviously number one. Finding your assets, monitoring those assets, whether it's through auto discovery or importing, the data is key. So getting at the data, whether it's space, power, cooling, networking, all the things that you can touch on and report on, that is key. And then understanding, how do you map all of your ports? How do you understand the status of an asset, whether it's the true state, is it currently working? What is the life cycle? Is it something that needs to be decommissioned within the next year? And how do you start planning for that? What's the warranty entitlement? All these things are things that you can track within the system, and it deals with the capacity of your system. So going back to that last slide, how do you forecast data center requirements? Well, if you don't even know what you have within the data center and the state of that deployment, you're going to have a really hard time. So DCIM will absolutely help you with that. And then you get into, what do you do with that data, right? So that's where you get into things like what-if analysis. So being able to take a project, put it into your platform, and it will tell you before you actually go deploy it, where you're going to see issues. So again, extremely valuable. We talk about how do we get a return from a DCIM. Well, that's definitely one place you're going to see, some operational agility increase, some operational costs go down. If you look at impact analysis, so I think this, really goes back to that decrease in outages. So understanding if something goes wrong, what's impacted both upstream and downstream. So if I get an error, I can quickly see what IT applications are impacted based on, where that happens within the data center, and I can take the appropriate action based on that. So it really gives you that stability and assurance that things are in a steady state, and when when that state changes, it gives you that ability to kind of triage the situation and act appropriately. And then obviously reporting and compliance, knowing what's going on within your data center, reporting that information out to the stakeholders, to the people, if it's a business unit, if it's a finance unit, if it's the executives, all that information is there at a hand. And compliance, there's, depending on what market you're in, there's lots of different levels of compliance. So DCIM will help you understand how do you track what goes on within the data center as well. And then finally, we started talking very briefly at the end about multi-site, whether it's multiple data centers within your infrastructure or going into cloud or colo type providers. Being able to manage data centers across multiple locations is really key these days as we continue to kind of expand into these hybrid scenarios. So if we talk about stumbling blocks, so the first one is, we've talked about it a lot so far, is really expectations. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have those expectations set up front. One good example, we talk about improved operational control and agility. If you want to be very honest, up front, you're going to see a negative impact on that. Anytime you're coming up a learning curve, you're learning a new program, it will negatively impact how your departments run, how they go through their day-to-day processes. But in the end, if you learn the platform, you implement the changes that need to happen to maintain that platform, you will absolutely realize some great improvements. Even things like risk, how do you define that? Again, we talked about people that have DCIM have fewer outages. It's because they're seeing things that interject risk into their data centers. But you need to define what is it that I need to know? Is it just knowing something could go wrong, knowing of what actually went wrong, or even automating the process to mitigate something going wrong? So those are all things that on the onset you need to understand. How are you going to expect a DCIM platform to help you through that risk mitigation process? So Andy, any big missing kind of overarching things that DCIM could do that we haven't touched on that you would add?
No, I mean, I think there are lots of things that DCIM can do, and some of them are quite unexpected, and some of them are really depend on what you integrate DCIM with, and that's kind of almost like a phase two. If you start integrating it with, for example, your purchasing of power, you'd start, you can get all kinds of insights, or as you've mentioned already, if you start linking it to your IT systems, and then you can respond according to where the IT workloads are being moved, or you can move the IT workloads as a response to issues on the ground. So I think it's, I do view DCIM as a kind of platform that has huge and kind of multifarious benefits, and they're not always very predictable. One thing, and you may be getting on to this, I think you probably are, but the one thing that we always find comes up over and over again is just getting the data in during the deployment, changing practices to make sure that the data is always put in future. In other words, keeping it accurate, because without a good database, asset management is not going to fulfill its potential, and probably quite a lot of other things won't work well either. So 2 points there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that change management process is absolutely critical to making sure that if you're not maintaining the system, and it's incorrect, it's going to give you the insights, but they're not gonna prove to be valuable because it's looking at things that aren't actually there. So I totally concur with that. So if we go kind of the next step, you've decided to go down the path, and it's really what you just talked about. It will overrun an organization if they're not ready for it. So I think one key, besides making sure that processes are aligned, processes are defined, and you understand what you're going to do with the platform, I always suggest taking the phased approach with deployment. Our typical process is implement asset management first. Understand what you have. Make sure it's in the system. Your next step is really start to monitor those devices. So anything that's critical, make sure that you're getting that data ingress into the system. So Andy definitely just hit that. If you're not getting the data, you don't have anything to crunch or take action on. So that's your baseline. Once you have everything within the platform and it's starting to monitor the data, then you get into what do we do with the platform. So begin managing your projects, doing work order task flow through the platform. So maintaining that change management, and then reporting and analytics. So reporting is it's early on in the process as well. Once you have data, you can report on it. But as you grow, you can get more advanced reports, things like life cycle reports, budgeting reports. How do you plan on your spend on the next year, the next 2 years? These are all insights that a DCIM platform with data about the devices it's monitoring can really help you work out. So absolutely some powerful tools, but take a step into it approach. Don't try and go up the full learning curve in one step, or you will end up in that unhappy side. And just keep in mind, no two DCIM deployments are the same. It's definitely good to go get advice from other people that have done it, but their organization is not exactly like yours. So just be cautious that as you're aligning your goals and your organization, that you don't have to duplicate exactly what somebody else has done. But it is good to get advice.
Yeah. What help can you give to people to get that first stage with the assets into the database? Various tools or advice, help, because that's the one that comes up over and over again.
Yeah, I think there's really a couple ways. So having a platform that can auto-discover and auto-discover across multiple protocols is really one big key. As you walk into a data center, you're going to see lots of different ways to communicate with devices. You'll see everything from twisted pairs to SNMP, over the network. So I think understanding what do you have within the data center and how does it speak to the world. That's kind of your first step, and then making sure whether you use professional deployment services or your own staff, you need to understand how does that system speak. Most DCIMs, I think in these days have gotten mature in the sense that they will speak your standard protocols out of the box. But if you do have that kind of off the cuff piece of equipment that does something strange, having that ability to get it in and tweak it is definitely key.
Right. Other comments on this is that we find that probably about half the people we talk to, they want to start with asset management, and about the other half want to start with monitoring. And sometimes they don't intend to do both parts of it, although they usually end up doing both parts of it. But it seems that people have a very fixed idea of where they're going to start. There's not always asset management first, for example.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the process of the deployment is you need to talk through that. And
I certainly agree. No two are alike; they vary hugely.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, talk to whoever you select and make sure that they help you kind of walk through that process. But you can't saying, "Hey, we're going to do DCIM," and just make it happen is a very slippery slope. All right, and the last one, again, budget overrun. It hits everybody's heart, and there's really two kinds, money and time. So money is one of those, again, setting those expectations up front. There's a lot of platforms out there that do features a la carte, and so that can definitely be a challenge if you have something that you want to do further on down the road, but you're not talking about it day one. That can absolutely cost you more money than you ever expected to go get the features you need. So just be aware that between the platform itself and deployment services, those are your two big kind of cost drivers. But don't forget that there might be additional staffing needs. There might be changes that actually have to happen within the organization that are not directly linked to putting in a DCIM software. And kind of the normal things you talk about. So don't overlook the staff. Don't overlook process changes and the impact that those make to your organization.
Mm-hmm.
And then time. Obviously, it's going to take time. Your staff is going to have to learn it. You really need to make sure that you give it the time you need in the deployment stage to get it stood up, to change those processes, and make sure that you maintain it and do the change management. So. A lot of people don't talk about budgeting time, but if your organization isn't ready for it from a time standpoint and they're too busy, fighting fires or deploying other things, it's going to end up sitting on a shelf as well. So definitely want to think about the time and staffing aspect. Anything else that people need to remember when they budget?
No, I mean, I agree about the a la carte, and I'm kind of reminded about, I was involved in the software industry when SAP and so on was having their enormous surge in growth in ERP, and there was a lot of horror stories about that software, and almost every time it was because of customization, because of a la carte approaches. So, and clearly you're right about time and money are intricately linked. So, yeah, it's a big issue, and you've got to approach it very seriously at the outset.
Absolutely. So from that, I mean, that's the key stumbling blocks that I want you guys to understand. For more info, feel free to reach out. We'll be at HCTS, so we'd love to talk to you guys there. You can reach out to me directly via email or visit our website if you'd like. But hopefully this information helps and gets you a little more ammunition in your quiver to go a little bit further. So Kristen, I'll let you take it back over.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike and Andy. It is now time for our Q&A session. And as a quick reminder, just type in the question in the box below and we'll get to as many as we can. And we do actually have a few, and I think we've got time for a few of these. So first question, does it make sense to do a proof of concept or POC before implementation?
So actually, we always advise people to do something that, to test out and prove the manufacturer's or supplier's claims, test the competency of our own staff, etc. So I would say absolutely yes, it does. I completely understand from a supplier's point of view that is an added expense, especially if they don't go on to win the contract. But from an operator's point of view, it definitely makes sense.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, it is a part of that process, and I think it would behoove anyone to make sure that they do a POC. And again, you're going through that process to understand as you take it to scale. Yeah, yes, you're proving out the platform, but you're also taking, you're mitigating some of that risk by doing it at a smaller scale initially. So I think it's wise to go through that POC stage.
Great. Next question. Is there such a thing as a reference document available in the industry for doing an RFP? The requirements can be complex. Mike, do you want to start with that one and then I'll chip in?
Yeah, I think, I think there's absolutely tons of resources out there today. I don't know of any direct, places to send someone to get a list of requirements. If, we obviously have our kind of standard documentation that would help with that process. I think if you reach out to any vendor, they can give you, kind of the high, mid, and very deep level explanations. But yeah, I don't know, Andy, if you know a good place to point somebody to start that process.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just reiterate the point that you made earlier that no two DCIM implementations are alike. The requirements vary widely, and if you ticked every box, you'd end up with a very, very expensive system. So we actually do some consulting around this. So we do have some RFP documents, but we don't release them because we think it needs to be. We need to talk people through them because you shouldn't be ticking every box and asking every question. You have to work out what you want. It needs to be allied to your business requirements. So we do have some guidance, but there is not such a thing as an open document or something that you could just download and send off to a vendor.
Yeah, and make it conversational. Absolutely, I agree. It needs to be a conversation.
Yeah.
Great. And I think we'll have time for one last question. How is the cloud going to change all of this, meaning DC management as a service?
Well, so my colleague Rhonda Acerto has done a lot of work on this, and she's actually a big believer in the notion that almost all data center management will go to the cloud, with perhaps the exception being some local real-time monitoring. So I think all the suppliers have work going on in this area. They have products, and I know Eaton does. So that is a long-term direction. I think still the market is mostly seeing value in on-site local deployments. But also the whole picture is changing because the actual workload in IT might be in one enterprise data center and let's say 2 colos and 3 cloud providers. And you do need to have an understanding of where your risks are and where you should put your workloads, and quite often the workloads will move between them. So there's quite a lot of different aspects to this, but it is having quite a big impact. And we do see quite a lot of the components of monitoring and equipment monitoring going into the cloud. And once you put data into the cloud, you have the opportunity to aggregate from different sites. Gives you some kind of big data or data lake, and that then opens up more opportunities for doing AI, which really requires a lot of data to start allowing the machines to draw insights from. So for the future, could be very, very significant, but it's very, very early days in DCIM and the data center. And if you're thinking about the next year, I wouldn't say there are that many situations where you need to be thinking about AI, for example. Anything to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from my standpoint, it's DCIM as a service is absolutely a conversation out there today. I think there are customers that if you're smaller and you are definitely staff hungry, doing it as a service is a good model to consider. So I definitely think there are people that they're looking at it. It makes sense, but again, I think it's a case by case thing to understand. Do you want that residing in a cloud, or do you want it on-prem? And I agree with you, Andy. Today, people definitely prefer to have it on-prem, but there is a customer set out there today that is definitely considering kind of the as-a-service model.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly reduces some of the upfront capex if you're using as a service, and it is possible to just start collecting or sending data to the cloud for a few pieces of equipment, and that's becoming, some evidence that that's getting some traction. So it could be a different model in future, but it is early days.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Andy. As a reminder, the on-demand replay will be available on Bright Talk shortly. So on behalf of Eaton and 451 Research, thank you again for attending and have a great day.